In 5 days, the Netherlands fell. But here is what your history books never told you. Hitler did not want to conquer the Dutch, he wanted to absorb them. And to prove they belonged to his empire, the Nazis created something chillingly familiar, a brand new Dutch East India Company. This is the story of the plan that would have erased the Netherlands forever. On May 29, 1940, just over 2 weeks after the Dutch military capitulated, Adolf Hitler bypassed his generals. Instead of establishing a standard military command like the ones occupying France and Belgium, he placed the Netherlands under a civilian administration. The man chosen to lead this experiment was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian Nazi lawyer who had recently helped orchestrate the Anschluss, the annexation of his own homeland. Seyss-Inquart arrived in The Hague with the title of Reichskommissar. This administrative decision was firmly rooted in Nazi racial ideology. In Hitler's worldview, the Dutch were a Broedervolk, a Germanic brother nation destined for eventual unification into a grand empire. To prepare the population for this union, the occupation began with strategic reassurance rather than immediate military oppression. In his inaugural address on May 29, 1940, Seyss-Inquart stood before Dutch officials and adopted a tone of striking moderation. He spoke of mutual respect, promised to defend Dutch freedom, and even paid tribute to the fallen soldiers of the Dutch army. He declared that Germany had no intention of depriving the Dutch of their liberty or imposing foreign political convictions upon them. This conciliatory posture was a calculated seduction. By keeping the existing Dutch civil service intact and presenting a veneer of partnership, Seyss-Inquart aimed to prevent resistance and win voluntary cooperation. Behind the velvet glove of this civilian rule lay a long-term strategy designed to erode the nation's independence from within, setting the path toward total absorption. To achieve this, Adolf Hitler issued a precise, classified directive to his administrators. The German leader ordered them to win Dutch cooperation voluntarily, guiding the population toward National Socialism through gradual pressure rather than visible force. This was a tactical choice designed to keep the domestic civil service functioning and prevent unrest while the deeper machinery of annexation was assembled. The true objective went far beyond a temporary military occupation or a wartime alliance. In Berlin, the SS leadership held a much more radical vision for the territory. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Albin Rauter, acting on direct instructions from Heinrich Himmler, made this end goal clear in internal communications. The Netherlands was not to be preserved as a sovereign state. Instead, the ultimate destination was complete absorption into a Greater Germanic Reich. In this planned imperial order, the Dutch nation would cease to exist. Its borders would be erased, its independent administrative offices dissolved, and its identity systematically merged into a vast German-dominated empire. The strategic display of respect for Dutch liberty was merely a temporary phase. While Dutch collaborationists believed they were negotiating for future autonomy within a European federation, the Nazi regime was already preparing the paperwork for their country's permanent disappearance. Nazi maps from the period illustrated this future, depicting the Netherlands not as an occupied ally, but as a provincial territory named Nederlanden within the Reich. This vision meant the complete eradication of the country's national symbols, the permanent exile of its royal house, and the eventual replacement of its sovereignty with total German administrative control. Under this strategy, the Dutch were being coaxed to participate in their own national erasure. Anton Mussert, the leader of the National Socialist movement in the Netherlands, became the most visible face of Dutch collaboration. Yet his ambition for the nation's future diverged sharply from the secret plans drafted in Berlin. Mussert rejected the prospect of outright German annexation. Instead, he promoted the creation of Dietsland, a pan-Dutch union that would merge the Netherlands with Flanders, the Dutch-speaking region of Belgium. In Mussert's vision, this expanded territory would remain a loyal, pro-German state, but it would retain its own separate political structure, borders, and national identity. He sought to secure a partnership under German leadership rather than permit total German control. Here lay the internal limit of Dutch collaboration. While Mussert believed he was building a path toward Dutch survival and future autonomy within a European federation, Nazi authorities viewed his geopolitical dreams as a mere convenience. To Hitler's inner circle, a sovereign Dietsland was entirely incompatible with the Reich's true objective, the complete erasure of the Dutch state. On December 12, 1941, Anton Mussert traveled to Berlin to bind his fate directly to the Führer. In a formal ceremony, the Dutch collaborator swore a personal oath of allegiance. Ik zweer u, Adolf Hitler, als Germaans leider trouw tot in den dood. Zo waarlijk helpe mij God. Mussert believed this ultimate display of loyalty would secure German respect and guarantee a semi-independent Dutch state. He was wrong. To the Nazi elite, Mussert's devotion was not a token of partnership, but a tool for administrative convenience. In December 1942, Mussert returned to Berlin, seeking to resolve the political future of the Netherlands. On December 14, 1942, Hitler granted him the title Leader of the Dutch People. It was a calculated, empty gesture. While collaborationist newspapers broadcast the appointment with fanfare, the Reich's leadership quietly ensured the title carried no actual authority. Real executive power remained entirely in the hands of Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and the SS, Mussert's dreams of a sovereign Dietsland, were dismissed in Berlin's corridors of power as a provincial fantasy. He had traded his nation's sovereignty for a symbolic title, operating not as a partner, but as an unwitting caretaker for the permanent erasure of his own country. On February 22, 1941, the illusion of a gentle occupation vanished in the streets of Amsterdam. German security forces rounded up 425 Jewish men at the Jonas Daniel Meyerplein, beating them publicly before deporting them to Buchenwald. The response from the Dutch population was swift and unprecedented. On February 25th, the outlawed Communist Party called for a general strike. By midday, Amsterdam ground to a halt. Trams stopped, factories closed, and docks fell silent as more than 300,000 workers walked out in defiance of this anti-Jewish persecution. It was the first mass public protest against Nazi racial policy in occupied Europe. For Arthur Seyss-Inquart, this strike was a direct rupture of his plans. The carefully cultivated myth of Germanic brotherhood and voluntary cooperation was shattered. The regime responded with immediate lethal force. SS and police units fired on crowds, arrested hundreds, and executed strike leaders in the coastal dunes. The period of strategic seduction was over. The occupation shifted to direct, violent coercion, forever hardening the division between the occupiers and the occupied. The violence in the streets of Amsterdam solidified into a permanent policy. Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart abandoned any remaining illusion of winning the Dutch population through gradual persuasion. The strike was crushed, and with it went the pretense of a voluntary integration into the Germanic Empire. Addressing the public in the wake of the unrest, Seyss-Inquart delivered a stark ultimatum. Mit uns oder gegen uns, ein drittes gibt es nicht mehr. With us or against us, there is no third option. This doctrine stripped away the velvet glove. The civil administration, once designed to gently coax the Dutch into submission, now operated as an instrument of direct coercion. German security forces intensified roundups, accelerated anti-Jewish deportations, and systematically dismantled local institutions. Anyone who did not actively support the regime was classified as an enemy. Having failed to absorb the Netherlands, through political seduction at home, the Nazi leadership looked beyond the nation's borders. They began preparing a radical experiment to reshape the Dutch population through forced expansion in the occupied East. On June 6, 1942, at Amaliastraat 1 in The Hague, the expansionist vision assumed a concrete, legal structure. Meinoud Rost van Tonningen, an influential National Socialist who also served as the president of the Dutch National Bank, signed the charter establishing a state-backed enterprise. Its name was selected to exploit national memory, the Nederlandsche Oost Compagnie. The title deliberately echoed the historic VOC, the Dutch East India Company that had established the nation's 17th century maritime empire. By reviving this historic symbol of global reach, the occupation authorities presented the colonization of Eastern Europe as a modern continuation of the Dutch Golden Age. The company operated as a public limited company backed by domestic financial institutions. It functioned as the administrative mechanism designed to channel Dutch capital, business, and labor toward the Baltic states and Ukraine. By linking the traditional Dutch identity of seafaring merchants with Hitler's geopolitical pursuit of Lebensraum, the regime created an institutional bridge. This corporation merged the Dutch economic and imperial legacy directly into the machinery of the Greater Germanic Reich. The Nederlandsche Oost Compagnie set out to recruit Dutch farmers, fishermen, and builders, rebranding them as Germanic pioneers. Their mission was to settle the occupied East, serving as the vanguard of Adolf Hitler's vision for a Lebensraum. The targeted settlement zones lay in conquered Ukraine and the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. In these territories, Dutch families were expected to establish model agricultural estates, construct fishing villages, and extract resources for the Reich's war effort. In preparation, the company established an agricultural training center in Rogachev. There, Dutch recruits studied German land management techniques, preparing to manage vast territories. This was a highly organized operation. Between 1941 and 1944, more than 5,000 Dutch civilians voluntarily boarded transports headed east. They were ordinary citizens, builders, agronomists, and young laborers who traveled to places like Liepāja, Latvia, to claim soil that had been violently cleared of its original inhabitants. By dispatching these pioneers, the occupation administration turned ideological rhetoric into physical policy. These civilian settlers served a highly militarized goal. Dutch hands and Dutch capital were now actively participating in the demographic reshaping of Eastern Europe, binding the future of the Dutch nation directly to the permanent conquests of the Nazi Empire. By 1944, the expansionist fantasy of a Dutch agricultural empire in the East dissolved into a violent retreat. The rapid advance of the Soviet Red Army shattered the settlements of the Nederlandsche Oost Compagnie, turning occupied Ukraine and the Baltic states into active battlefields. As the German front lines collapsed, the physical protection promised to the settlers evaporated. Soviet-backed partisans targeted the isolated Dutch estates. Colonists who had traveled east to build model farms instead faced brutal guerrilla warfare. Many Dutch farmers were killed in these partisan attacks, while others succumbed to disease during the chaotic withdrawal. The agricultural training center at Rogachev and the outlying outposts were abandoned to the advancing enemy. The colonization scheme collapsed under the weight of rushed evacuations and unmarked graves. The survivors who managed to flee the Soviet advance returned to a ruined Netherlands, destitute and widely branded as collaborators. The projected Dutch Empire in the East died before it could ever fully consolidate, leaving behind a legacy of lethal ambition and unfinished conquest. On July 15, 1944, Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart gathered senior German officials for a confidential meeting in the occupied Netherlands. The Allied landings in Normandy were underway. The Eastern colonization project had collapsed, and domestic sabotage was paralyzing the country's infrastructure. In this room, Seyss-Inquart delivered a stark, internal admission of administrative and ideological defeat. He confessed that the regime's attempt to, as he put it, geschulmeisterd the Dutch population had completely backfired. This German bureaucratic term, translating to being schoolmastered or patronized, captured the fundamental flaw of the entire occupation strategy. For 4 years, the occupiers had cast themselves as stern teachers, attempting to discipline the Dutch through forced labor, systematic resource extraction, and relentless pressure. They believed they could correct the population, gradually eroding their sovereign identity to prepare them for permanent integration into a Greater Germanic Reich. Instead, Seyss-Inquart admitted, this patronizing coercion had achieved the opposite. His exact words, later preserved in the International Military Tribunal records at Nuremberg, exposed the collapse of the seduction strategy from within the Nazi apparatus itself. Wir haben versucht, die Niederlande zu geschulmeistert, aber das Ergebnis war ein massiver Widerstand und die Arbeitsleistung sank dramatisch. We tried to schoolmaster the Netherlands, but the result was massive resistance and a dramatic drop in labor productivity. This admission marked the end of the Broedervolk illusion. 4 years of targeted propaganda, political execution, and corporate schemes had failed to turn the Dutch into willing National Socialists. The population had thoroughly rejected the promise of a Germanic brotherhood. Rather than participating in the peaceful erasure of their own nation, they had chosen absolute refusal. The fate of the Dutch nation teaches us a chilling truth. The erasure of a people can begin not with violence, but with a false promise of brotherhood. Today, sovereignty remains fragile, reminding us that identity must be defended in the mind as much as on the soil. Join the conversation in the comments below.